It was near midnight when the first tanks appeared. Or at least, that's what the Germans thought they saw. Through the drizzle and drifting smoke of the French countryside, the silhouettes loomed across the horizon, rows of Shermans, their barrels glinting faintly under the moonlight, engines rumbling low, voices barking commands in English. Searchlights cut through the fog. The ground seemed to tremble beneath the weight of steel. From the hilltop village of Treviere, a unit of the 116th Panzer Division stared in disbelief. Their field glasses revealed an entire armored column stretching into the darkness. Headlights moving, men shouting, radio chatter crackling with Allied code words. Then came the sound, the metallic churn of treads, the whine of heavy machinery, the drone of distant aircraft. It was a sound every German soldier had learned to fear, the sound of invasion, the coming thunder of the American war machine. Orders were shouted. Engines roared to life. The Panzer Grenadiers scrambled for their positions, but as they prepared for battle, something was wrong. The tanks never advanced. The artillery never fired. The voices in the same few none seemed to repeat the same orders. And when dawn finally broke over the fields of Normandy, the German spotters saw the truth. The tanks weren't tanks. The guns weren't real. And the soldiers, the hundreds of men they'd heard in the night, had vanished with the fog. All that remained were inflatable tanks, recording trucks and a few smiling artists in muddy fatigues, packing up their paintbrushes and loudspeakers. That was the first time the 116th Panzer Division met the Ghost Army, a unit so secret, even the American generals barely spoke its name aloud. The Ghost Army wasn't born in a command room or drafted on a battlefield. It was conceived in the quiet minds of artists, architects, and dreamers, men who saw that the most powerful weapon in war wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was belief. In early 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Europe, a handful of officers at the U.S. Army's Engineer Special Brigades were handed an impossible order: create confusion. Manipulate the enemy's perception. Make them see armies where there are none. From that line came the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unit so secret that its full existence remained classified for nearly 50 years. Within its ranks were painters from art schools in New York, sound engineers from Hollywood, architects from Yale, and radio operators who once built experimental transmitters in their garages. None of them were trained to kill. They were trained to deceive. The world would later call them the Ghost Army, a title earned not through violence, but illusion. The core of their mission was simple, though the execution was not. Where the Germans expected to find divisions of tanks, artillery, and men, the Ghost Army would make them appear, out of paint, sound, and light. Their weapons were not rifles, but rubber tape and wire. Each deception operation began the same way. A small convoy of trucks would roll into a designated sector, often at night. Under blackout conditions, and within hours, a vast encampment would appear. Canvas tents, rows of vehicles, command posts, fuel depots, even laundry lines, and towering above them all, the hulking silhouettes of armored divisions, the famous rubber Shermans. These inflatable tanks were works of art in themselves, meticulously crafted latex shells, painted to mimic shadows and battleware, capable of being inflated in 20 minutes by portable air compressors. At night, under low light, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. Even reconnaissance aircraft, flying at altitude, couldn't tell the difference. Alongside the visual illusions came the sound. That was the genius of the 3132nd Signal Service Company, Special. Sound engineers who used massive loudspeaker arrays and pre-recorded tracks of tanks moving, engines idling, even shouted commands. The recordings, made under controlled conditions in England using real armored divisions, were played back at full volume across miles of countryside. Each operation had its own sound plan. They could simulate the movement of an entire armored column, complete with ambient noises, hammering, clattering, shouted orders, and vehicle maintenance, so convincingly that German patrols often reported entire divisions assembling within earshot. In one of the earliest tests, a British officer remarked, "It's uncanny. You can feel them moving, even when you see nothing." The Ghost Army took that as the highest compliment, but the illusion wasn't complete without the final element: radio deception. Specialists from the Signal Company, 603rd Camouflage Battalion, manned portable radio stations designed to mimic the transmissions of real divisions. Using a technique called spoofing, they replicated the call signs, rhythms, and habits of genuine units. A German signals officer once said later in interrogation, "We could tell the American divisions by the way they breathed on the airwaves." The Ghost Army learned to copy that too, right down to the pauses between words. To the Germans, this ghost network was indistinguishable from reality, and reality, in war, was everything. As D-Day approached, the Ghost Army was deployed to France. They were given orders so vague they bordered on impossible. Create diversions strong enough to misdirect armored divisions. They landed in Normandy under the cover of darkness in July 1944, weeks after the first invasion waves. Their convoy was small, almost invisible compared to the massive army sweeping inland. But their impact would ripple across Europe. They were artists in uniform, soldiers who sketched instead of shot. Yet every illusion they built carried the weight of life and death, for real troops depending on their deception to survive. When the 116th Panzer Division, also known as the Greyhounds, moved toward Avranches in August 1944, the Ghost Army was sent to intercept, not with force, but with fantasy. Under the command of Colonel Harry Reeder, the unit set up camp near the village of Trevières. Within hours, the empty fields bloomed into an entire armored division. Trucks inflated rubber tanks, painters daubed fake mud on fabric tracks, engineers laid out dummy airfields with plywood fighters, their propellers turning on small electric motors. At night, sound trucks began their concert, an hour-long loop of moving armor and shouted orders. Projected through the mist from 10 miles away, German scouts saw the flicker of headlights, heard the clamor of assembly. To them, the Americans had reinforced the sector with at least 2 divisions, the 4th Armored and 79th Infantry. In reality, fewer than 100 Ghost Army soldiers were on site. Inside the fog of war, perception was truth, and the Germans believed the 116th Panzer halted its advance. Reports flooded their headquarters describing massive concentrations of Allied armor. The division's commanding officer, General Gerhard Graf von Schwerin, issued orders to reposition, sending his reconnaissance battalion south to locate the Phantom Army. By the time they realized they'd been fooled, it was too late. The real American forces under the 5th Armored Division and 35th Infantry had slipped through the weakened flank and encircled Avranches. Deception of artists had just saved thousands of lives. In the WWII debriefing the next morning, an American officer asked one of the Ghost Army sound engineers, "What did it feel like tricking an entire division?" The man shrugged, still holding his paintbrush. "Like playing God with cardboard," he said. They laughed, but there was an unease beneath it. For every illusion they built, someone out there was dying in the real war. The Ghost Army carried that weight quietly. When not constructing fake divisions, they spent their nights sketching bombed-out villages, painting portraits of civilians, or photographing their own handiwork, proof that imagination could be as powerful as artillery. One artist, Arthur Shilstone, later recalled painting camouflage nets by day and sketching ruined churches by night. "We were soldiers, yes," he said, "but we were also witnesses. Witnesses to how fear could be shaped, sound could be weaponized, and art could wage war." The success at Trevières was only the beginning. As the Allies surged through France, the Ghost Army followed, always moving, always changing, a traveling circus of illusion. They built phantom airfields, staged fake command posts complete with actors playing generals, even used military police to redirect real convoys toward imaginary units. Each operation grew bolder, more elaborate, and each one drew them closer to the heart of Europe and closer to danger, because the Germans were beginning to realize something was wrong. And soon, the illusionists would face their first true test, one that would push their art and their courage to the very edge of survival. By late summer 1944, the Ghost Army had become a moving illusion, a mirage that changed shape with every sunrise. Their convoys slipped along the narrow French roads behind the front lines, each truck carrying something that shouldn't exist: inflatable tanks folded like giant skins, sound recording units disguised as command vehicles, and boxes of paint, canvas, and imagination. They were the only American unit expected to pretend to be multiple others. Their orders came from the highest levels of chef, the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, and every mission began the same way. The illusionists were told where the real divisions were not, and where the Germans must believe they were. It was psychological warfare on a scale no one had attempted before. Inside their temporary headquarters, often an abandoned farmhouse or half-ruined chapel, the officers of the 23rd Headquarters, special troops spread maps across wooden tables, cigarette smoke coiled upward, mixing with the scent of mud and oil. The faint rumble of distant artillery pulsed through the floor. Captain Fred Fox, one of the operation planners, drew red arrows on a map of the Loire Valley. "The 116th Panzer Division is probing along this corridor," he said quietly. "We're to convince them the U.S. 6th Armored is massing here, along this ridge. In truth, the 6th is 80 miles north. If they believe we're here, they'll hold their advance another week." Lieutenant Bill Blass, a young art student from Indiana who would one day become a famous fashion designer, nodded. "So we're building an army from air again," he murmured. "Exactly," said Fox. "Only this time, they're listening closer." The Germans had begun to suspect the presence of a phantom unit. Radio operators had intercepted strange transmissions, divisions appearing where no casualties or supply lines were ever reported. Recon planes had photographed tank formations that seemed to vanish overnight. But even as doubt spread through the Wehrmacht, the illusions kept working, because fear feeds on uncertainty, and the Ghost Army knew exactly how to nourish it. They divided into their three disciplines: visual, sound, and radio deception, like a theater troupe preparing for a show. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled the stagecraft. They laid out hundreds of inflatable tanks and vehicles in carefully arranged patterns that matched authentic armored divisions. Every detail mattered. Tire tracks carved into mud by dragging planks behind jeeps, footprints pressed into dirt to suggest men moving between tents. Even fake campfires lit under half-buried barrels to mimic cooking smoke from afar. The 3103nd Sound Company prepared their audio illusion. Sergeant Tony Schwartz, an experimental sound artist from New York, rewired the playback systems to allow overlapping loops, tanks idling in one channel, shouted orders in another, the metallic ring of tools echoing through a third. At night, under the blanket of fog, they played their orchestrated chaos across valleys and villages. From the German lines, it was indistinguishable from the sound of an entire armored corps assembling for attack. Meanwhile, the signal company began transmitting. Their operators sat inside cramped trucks tapping out coded bursts on portable radios, identical in cadence and frequency to those used by real frontline divisions. They maintained regular contact schedules, sending dummy messages about troop movements, fuel shortages, and command orders. By the time the Germans triangulated the signals, an entire phantom army had been born, and yet only 1,100 men existed to sustain the illusion. They moved with astonishing speed. In August, the Ghost Army relocated from Normandy to the Loire in less than 48 hours, staging a full fake presence of the 6th Armored Division along the riverbanks. The deception worked flawlessly. German reconnaissance reported heavy American armor concentrations, forcing the 116th Panzer to redeploy. That same week, real American forces captured Chartres with minimal resistance. The Ghost Army had changed the rhythm of the war without firing a single shot, but their success came with risk. Their operations were often perilously close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. German patrols occasionally stumbled upon their positions, forcing the illusionists to act their parts convincingly enough to survive discovery. In one incident outside the village of La Haye-du-Puy, a squad of German soldiers approached what appeared to be a heavily armed Allied tank column. The Ghost Army men, mostly artists with no combat experience, had seconds to react. Corporal Bob Tompkins, a painter from Brooklyn, grabbed a wrench, ducked behind an inflatable Sherman, and began tightening imaginary bolts. "Just mechanics, boys," he whispered. His comrades followed suit, hammering at rubber treads and pretending to check oil levels. The Germans watched from a distance, uncertain. The tanks looked real enough. One soldier even saluted. Then they turned back into the woods. The Americans collapsed in silent laughter, half relief, half disbelief. Had the Germans gotten any closer, one stray bullet would have deflated the entire operation, literally and figuratively. But the Ghost Army wasn't all illusion and laughter. Beneath the artistry lay an undercurrent of exhaustion and moral strain. These men were not hardened infantry. They were illustrators, sculptors, ad designers, men who had studied color theory and architecture before being handed rifles. Now they found themselves creating theater on the edges of death. At night, when the loudspeakers fell silent, many of them sat sketching in the dark, drawing not tanks or maps, but faces. Farmers, children, the ruins of churches still smoldering from air raids. They were surrounded by war but forbidden to wage it. Private Ellsworth Kelly, a quiet art student from Boston, kept a journal filled with drawings of burned-out villages and notes about light falling through shattered windows. "We painted illusions by day," he wrote, "and tried to remember reality by night." In September, they moved toward the Moselle. This time, the stakes were even higher. The German 15th Army had regrouped near Metz, threatening to outflank General Patton's Third Army. The Ghost Army was ordered to create the illusion that Patton had reinforced the southern flank, forcing the Germans to divert. The operation, codenamed Bettemburg, would test every skill they had learned. The chosen site was a stretch of open valley east of Nancy. Under cover of night, the convoy arrived, trucks with dim headlights hooded by blackout curtains. They moved in total silence. Every bump on the dirt road rattled the air tanks stacked in the back. When dawn rose, the valley looked transformed. Dozens of fake vehicles lined the ridgeline, half-tracks, command jeeps, even field kitchens made from wooden crates. Signal towers reached skyward, their wires vanishing into painted camouflage nets. From the hills across the river, the illusion was perfect. Meanwhile, in hidden bunkers, the sound team unleashed its symphony. Diesel engines shouted orders, the rhythmic clank of tank treads over bridges. German artillery observers, scanning through binoculars, immediately reported movement of major armor units. Within hours, German command redirected reserves southward, thinning the northern defenses where Patton's real division struck. Once again, deception had rewritten the battlefield, but with every success came the risk of exposure. On the second night of Operation Bettemburg, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane broke through cloud cover and photographed the valley under moonlight. The film, when developed, revealed something odd: tire tracks that stopped abruptly, shadows that didn't align. German intelligence officers debated the images for hours. One insisted it was camouflage. Another suspected trickery. In the end, uncertainty paralyzed them. The tanks might have been fake, but what if they weren't? And so they waited. That hesitation saved thousands of American soldiers advancing elsewhere. For the Ghost Army, uncertainty itself had become their greatest weapon. By autumn, the unit had grown into a strange brotherhood, part circus troupe, part combat outfit. They lived under constant tension, never sure whether their illusions would hold or collapse under enemy fire. They called themselves the Traveling Roadshow. Wherever they went, rumors followed, villages whispering that an army had arrived overnight, then vanished by morning. Once, in a small French hamlet, a local farmer watched as the Americans packed up their inflatable tanks. He approached, confused. "Are these real?" he asked. A soldier grinned. "Real enough to scare the devil," he said, handing the man a paintbrush. The farmer touched the rubber hull and laughed, shaking his head. "You Americans," he said softly. "You make war like magicians." He wasn't wrong. The Ghost Army's ranks were filled with men destined for fame far beyond the war. Bill Blass, who would redefine American fashion. Ellsworth Kelly, who would revolutionize abstract art. Art Kane, who would become a world-renowned photographer. But here, under the cold rain and camouflage nets, they were brothers in deception. Artists painting illusions that could save lives. One of them, Sergeant John Jarvie, summed it up in a letter home. "We make them see what isn't there, so our boys can live to see what is." The line became an unofficial motto. As the rains of October swept over Lorraine, the Ghost Army prepared for their most dangerous mission yet. The 116th Panzer Division, the same unit they had fooled months before, was regrouping near the German border. This time, the Germans were wary. They had reports of the Phantom Division and suspected a deception unit operating with the Americans. Orders came down to Reeder: deploy, but proceed with extreme caution. The convoy rolled out once again, paintbrushes, air pumps, and courage packed tightly together. Ahead lay a new battlefield, a new illusion, and perhaps for some of them their first true encounter with death. The snow fell in silence, thick heavy flakes swirling through the black forest near the Moselle. It was December 1944 and the war had turned cold. The trees stood like sentinels, their branches sagging under frost. The Ghost Army had been on the move for days, their trucks crawling through narrow, frozen roads that seemed to stretch into nothing. Their mission this time was madness. The 116th Panzer Division, the very same formation they had deceived twice before, had reappeared on the Allied front. Hardened by retreat and desperation, the Germans were now part of the counteroffensive that would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Intelligence feared a breakout across the Saar River, and so, once again, the illusionists were called to stand where no real division could. This time, the deception had to hold under fire. They arrived at the outskirts of Bouzonville, a small town clawed from the hills, its church spire shattered, its windows like black eyes staring into the cold. The order was simple: convince the 116th Panzer that a massive American armored force, the 90th Infantry Division, was preparing to strike from the west. In truth, the nearest combat unit was 20 miles away. If the Germans advanced, the illusionists would be overrun. As the convoy rolled into the valley, snow muffled every sound. The air compressors hissed in rhythm, inflating rubber Shermans under camouflage tarps. The men moved quickly, hands red from the cold, eyes fixed on their work. Captain Fred Fox stood beside a half-track, collar turned up, studying the terrain through field glasses. "We're exposed here," he muttered. "If they spot us too soon, it's over." Sergeant Tony Schwartz, head of the sound crew, clambered up onto a truck roof, his gloved hands fumbling with the amplifier cables. "Then we make them hear us before they see us," he said, teeth chattering. By dusk, the hills echoed with the mechanical roar of an army that didn't exist. Recorded tank engines thundered through the valleys, bouncing between the ridges until the night vibrated with phantom power. German reconnaissance patrols, lurking beyond the woods, heard it first, the unmistakable cadence of engines massing for assault. They radioed reports back to Division Command. Enemy armor detected, multiple companies. Engines constant since 1600 hours. Von Schwerin's staff listened carefully. It matched the same pattern they'd encountered months ago, a division appearing overnight where none existed before. But this time, they would test it. At 2300 hours, the first shells screamed overhead. The valley lit up in flashes of orange. Explosions rolled across the snow, shaking the inflatable tanks and scattering debris. The Ghost Army dove for cover as shrapnel sliced through canvas and air hoses. "Hold your positions," Captain Fox shouted through the din. "Keep the sound running. They can't know we're fake." The men obeyed even as the blasts tore into the hillside. Tony Schwartz huddled behind a truck, shielding the speaker arrays with his body. A shell landed 50 yards away, sending a wave of dirt over the equipment. Through the smoke, one of the inflatable tanks deflated slowly, collapsing like a dying beast. The men could only watch. Private Bill Sales, the youngest in the platoon, crawled out from beneath a truck and began patching bullet holes in the rubber hull, his breath turning to frost in the air. "She still looks good from a distance," he gasped. "Then that's far enough," another soldier yelled back. They laughed, a hollow, defiant laugh that sounded almost insane in the chaos. The illusion had to hold. By midnight, the bombardment ceased. The Germans had paused, uncertain whether they'd hit real armor or smoke and shadows. Scouts were ordered forward to confirm. The Ghost Army heard them before they saw them. Faint voices in the dark, crunching snow, the glint of helmets in the moonlight. Fox whispered, "Positions. Make it look alive." Men leapt to their stations, moving like actors on a stage. They struck matches to light cigarettes, walked between the fake tanks, even shouted orders into the wind. A few fired rifles into the air to simulate sentries on alert. The Germans froze. From their vantage, it looked authentic. Soldiers on patrol, vehicles idling, smoke rising from campfires. They watched for 10 minutes, then fell back into the forest. The illusion lived another night. In the morning, the damage was clear. Dozens of rubber tanks lay punctured, slumped in grotesque shapes. Air compressors wheezed like dying lungs. The engineers worked wordlessly, patching holes, repainting shadows, re-inflating the fleet. Every hour bought them another chance to fool the enemy. But beneath the surface, the men were fraying. Private Ellsworth Kelly, the artist soldier, wrote in his notebook that day, "We live among ghosts, our own and the ones we make. The snow hides the blood, but not the sound." They were surrounded by the echoes of their own deception, a symphony of fear they had composed and could no longer silence. 2 days later, the situation turned desperate. The German artillery returned heavier than before. Their shells bracketed the valley, creeping closer with every volley. Scouts reported Panzer movements in the forest. Colonel Harry Reeder arrived at dawn, his face pale beneath his helmet. "We've done what we came for," he said quietly. "Time to vanish." The withdrawal had to be invisible, as convincing as the arrival. The men began dismantling the illusion in reverse order. First the sound, then the radio transmissions, finally the visual decoys. Trucks crept out one by one, leaving behind only shadows and empty impressions in the snow. As the last convoy rolled toward Metz, the first German tanks rumbled into the valley. Their crews stared in confusion at the scene before them. Hundreds of abandoned tire tracks, campfires still smoldering, and the twisted remains of fake armor half buried in snow. A Panzer officer dismounted, kicking at one of the rubber carcasses. It folded under his boot like fabric. He stood there a long moment, silent, before muttering, "Verdammt. Ghosts again." The illusion had bought 48 crucial hours, enough for the real American divisions to fortify the line south of Luxembourg. In that span, thousands of soldiers were saved, but the cost to the deceivers was invisible. That night, the Ghost Army bivouacked in a ruined barn outside Metz. The wind howled through broken rafters. Men huddled around a small fire, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow. Tony Schwartz turned to Kelly, voice low. "Do you ever think we've gone too far?" Kelly stared into the flames. "We only lie to save lives," he said. But lies have echoes. They sat in silence. Outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the fields where their phantom tanks once stood. The illusion was gone, but its ghosts remained. In the weeks that followed, the Ghost Army continued its strange pilgrimage across Europe, crossing rivers, staging fake offensives, drawing fire away from real troops. They operated near Verdun, Remagen, and Mainz, each time constructing entire armies from nothing, only to dissolve into mist again. Their greatest deception came in March 1945, during Operation Viersen, when they impersonated the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions to divert German attention from the actual crossing of the Rhine River. It was the culmination of everything they had learned, a perfect blend of visual art, sonic manipulation, and psychological mastery. For 3 days, they created a world that didn't exist. Convoys rolling, artillery flashes, radio traffic, even fake MPs directing traffic along dirt roads. German intercepts confirmed the ruse. The enemy expected the Rhine crossing near Wessel, precisely where the Ghost Army wanted them to look. Meanwhile, the real assault crossed the river 30 miles south, unopposed. When the news reached the illusionists' camp, there was no cheer, only exhaustion. They had spent nearly a year pretending to be armies that never were, waging war without firing a shot. The lines between truth and deception had blurred until even they could barely tell the difference. In April 1945, as Germany crumbled, the Ghost Army rolled through the Rhineland. Villages surrendered to them, to an army made of rubber and tape. German officers laid down weapons before men who carried paintbrushes instead of bayonets. For a moment, it felt like the ultimate punchline to a terrible joke. Then came the news. The war in Europe was ending. The Ghost Army received no fanfare, no medals, no recognition. Their existence was still classified. Their mission, a tapestry of lies, would remain secret for decades. But among themselves, they understood. As they stood on a bluff overlooking the Rhine, Captain Fox looked out over the water, the ruins of the Reich smoldering beyond. "We fought without killing," he said softly. "That has to count for something." Behind him, Tony Schwartz turned off the last sound truck. The speakers crackled once, then went silent. For the first time in months, there was only wind. When they returned home, the men of the Ghost Army disappeared into civilian life. Some became artists again. Some never painted another stroke. Bill Blass would say years later, "War taught me that illusion is a form of survival." Ellsworth Kelly, the quiet one, never spoke of his service. But his art, simple, abstract, filled with light and absence, carried echoes of those empty fields in France where tanks were shadows and truth was something you had to build by hand. They had fooled the enemy. They had survived. And in doing so, they had left behind one of the strangest, most beautiful legacies of the Second World War. A war fought not with destruction, but imagination. The Ghost Army faded into history, unseen, unsung, but never forgotten by those who had once walked among its illusions. The war ended not with a gunshot, but with a silence so deep it felt unreal. For the men of the Ghost Army, it was the first quiet they had known in almost 2 years. No distant artillery, no engine loops thrumming from loudspeakers, no shouts carried through fog. Just birdsong and the wind moving gently through ruined towns. They stood on the banks of the Rhine when the news arrived. The sky above was gray and swollen with spring rain. Across the river, smoke still curled from what was left of vessel. The men were filthy, hollow-eyed, their uniforms patched and faded from months of travel. But when the word surrender reached them, no one cheered. Captain Fred Fox simply lowered his binoculars and exhaled. "That's it," he said softly. "Our ghosts can rest." Around him, the soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops looked at one another in disbelief. For so long they had lived inside illusions, constructing false divisions, false sounds, false movements, that the idea of reality returning felt strange, almost intrusive. They had fooled an empire. Now they had to learn how to be real again. The convoy crossed into Luxembourg 2 days later. Their orders were simple: stand down, await reassignment. But no one seemed to know what to do with them. They weren't an infantry unit. They weren't engineers in the usual sense. They were a classified experiment, a contradiction wrapped in rubber and wire. When they reached the staging area outside Trier, the quartermaster squinted at their paperwork. "Never heard of you boys," he muttered. "That's the point," replied Sergeant Tony Schwartz. He smiled faintly, but there was no humor behind it. The Ghost Army set up camp one last time. No decoys this time, no fake tanks or radio plays, just tents and fires and long, silent meals. The men wandered the fields like sleepwalkers, unsure how to exist without illusion. Ellsworth Kelly sat alone by the riverbank sketching the bridge ahead, its arches shattered, reflections trembling in the water. In his notebook he wrote, "When the smoke clears, the shadows remain." That line would later appear in abstract form, in the paintings that made him famous. Vast panels of color and absence, each one whispering of the empty landscapes he once built to deceive. A week later, Colonel Reeder gathered his men. They stood in formation between 2 battered trucks, the air heavy with drizzle. "Gentlemen," he began, "you've done things no one will ever know. You've saved thousands of lives by making the enemy believe in phantoms. History may not remember you, but the men who lived because of you will." He paused, the words catching slightly. "Our work ends here. But someday someone will tell it properly." The men saluted. There were no medals, no photographers, no official commendations, just the quiet sound of rain striking canvas. Then, one by one, they were reassigned or sent home. The Ghost Army vanished like the illusions it had created. Back in America, spring was turning to summer. The cities roared with parades for returning heroes. The 82nd Airborne, the Marines from Iwo Jima, the pilots from the 8th Air Force. The Ghost Army marched in none of them. Their unit remained classified under the Office of Strategic Services. Their families knew only that they'd been in engineering. When they tried to explain, the words sounded absurd. Bill Blass returned to New York and opened a small tailoring shop. His friends asked what he'd done in the war. He smiled and said, "Costume design, more or less." Tony Schwartz went back to sound recording but found that music no longer sounded the same. He had spent too long bending sound into fear. When trains passed at night, he still heard the loops of engines he had played through the fog. Ellsworth Kelly moved to Paris to study art. He painted shapes that seemed empty to others but were, to him, filled with everything unsaid: the noise, the danger, the strange beauty of illusion. And Captain Fred Fox, the planner, joined an advertising agency in Chicago. He spent his days crafting images meant to persuade, not armies this time, but consumers. War taught me one thing, he told a colleague years later. People believe what they feel more than what they see. For decades, their story stayed buried. Files locked in the Pentagon marked top secret. Photographs mislabeled or destroyed. Men sworn to silence, even their unit designation was stripped from public rosters. When veterans gathered for reunions, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops wasn't invited, because officially, it had never existed. The men aged quietly. Their hair turned silver. Their hands, once steady with brushes and wires, grew unsteady. Yet when they met, in cafes, in small town halls, in fading VFW posts, they talked in the language only they understood. They spoke of Operation Brest, Bettembourg, Viersen, of air pumps failing in the rain, of German shells bursting near rubber Shermans, of laughter that sounded like madness. Sometimes, they brought out their old sketchbooks, drawings of fake tanks, false roads, and quiet faces glimpsed in the glow of headlights. They were stories drawn in graphite and memory, fading like the ink of a forgotten war. In 1951, one of them, Sergeant Sandy Levy, a radio operator, tried to publish an article about the Ghost Army. It was stopped by the censors. The official response read, "Disclosure of classified deception techniques could compromise national security." Levy folded the letter and placed it in a box, along with his photographs. He never tried again, and so the silence stretched on. For 40 years, the Ghost Army remained a rumor whispered among veterans, mentioned briefly in bars. Some dismissed it as myth. The idea that artists and designers had fought Hitler with paint and sound seemed too strange to be true. But truth has a way of resurfacing. In 1985, a retired documentary filmmaker named Rick Beyer stumbled across a footnote while researching the Normandy campaign. It mentioned the 23rd HQ Special Troops, Deception Operations, European Theater. Intrigued, he tracked down surviving members. What he found stunned him. Trunks of sketches, photographs of rubber tanks, reels of sound recordings, letters written in code. The ghosts began to speak again. One by one, the veterans told their stories. They spoke of fog and fire, of laughter in the dark, of terror and triumph woven together. They described the feeling of watching their illusions ripple across the landscape, knowing that behind the art lay thousands of real lives depending on their success. Bayer's documentary aired in the early 2000s. The world saw the photographs at last and the black and white images of men inflating tanks like balloons, of artists painting camouflage, of soldiers stringing cables through mud. Audiences were astonished. How could such a thing have been hidden for so long? The veterans smiled. For them, secrecy had been habit. "We were ghosts," said Tony Schwartz, his voice rasping with age. "It's only right that we stayed invisible." Recognition came slowly. In 2013, the U.S. Congress passed a bill honoring the Ghost Army with a unit citation. By then, most of the men were gone. At the ceremony, a handful of survivors, their uniforms replaced by dark suits and medals glinting under fluorescent light, stood before a display of their wartime photographs. On one easel was a picture of an inflatable tank sagging in the mud, another of young soldiers laughing beside a sound truck. Ellsworth Kelly's painting Spectrum Colors, arranged by chance, hung nearby, its fields of color catching the light like fragments of memory. A reporter asked one of the old men if he'd ever felt guilty for deceiving the enemy. The veteran chuckled. "Son," he said, "we lied so others could tell the truth." Later that night, after the ceremony, the few remaining members gathered in a hotel bar. The air smelled of bourbon and nostalgia. They raised their glasses in a quiet toast. "To the ghosts," said one. "To the artists," said another. "To the belief that imagination can save lives," whispered Fred Fox's grandson, who had come to honor him. The glasses clinked softly. For a moment, it felt like 1944 again. The crackle of radios, the rustle of canvas, the heartbeat of courage masked as art. Then the sound faded, leaving only the hum of neon and the slow rhythm of rain against the windows. The Ghost Army's legacy lives not in monuments or battle honors, but in the quiet understanding that creativity itself can be a shield. They proved that deception, when wielded with conscience, could preserve rather than destroy. They reminded the world that even in the darkest hours, imagination remains humanity's most unpredictable weapon. In a way, their mission never truly ended. Every artist who challenges fear with creation, every engineer who builds for peace instead of war, continues the work of those forgotten illusionists. And somewhere, in a dusty European field where snow once fell over rubber tanks and phantom engines, the wind still moves through the grass, whispering faintly, as if the ghosts are still rehearsing their lines. The night sky above France is quiet now. 80 years have passed since the roar of engines and the whisper of phantoms rolled through these valleys. The fields that once held rubber tanks are green with barley. The trenches have softened into shadows in the soil. Yet sometimes, when the wind moves just right, you can almost hear the faint hum of air compressors, the ghostly murmur of men laughing softly in the dark. History remembers the victories of steel and fire, Normandy, the Bulge, Berlin, but few recall the victories won with silence, paint, and courage. The Ghost Army left no ruins, no monuments carved from marble. Their legacy lingers in photographs hidden in attics, in sketches yellowed with age, in the distant echo of a radio transmission that once fooled a Panzer Division into standing still. It begins with a photograph, a young man crouching beside an inflatable Sherman tank, paint-stained fingers gripping a brush. The wind catches the edge of the canvas. The light glances off his cheek. His name is unknown to most, but in that frozen frame he is both artist and soldier, crafting illusion as defense, beauty as shield. The image fades, and the story breathes again. When historians finally pieced together the Ghost Army's operations, what astonished them most was not the deception itself, but its artistry. Every ruse had been a composition, every illusion a performance. Fred Fox's maps were storyboards. Tony Schwartz's sound loops were symphonies. Ellsworth Kelly's camouflage nets were brushstrokes across the earth. Their battlefield was not the front line, but the imagination of the enemy. Military analysts would later call it psychological dominance through misdirection. Artists would call it the triumph of form over fear. But to the men themselves, it had simply been survival, the only way to make sense of chaos. They had turned war into theater, not out of mockery but mercy. When the declassified reports were finally released, they told stories that read like fiction. Operation Brest. 500 men and a dozen inflatables hold back 2 German divisions. Operation Bettenberg. A phantom armored corps redirects the 15th Army, saving Patton's flank. Operation Viersen. 100 artists convince Hitler's remaining commanders that 30,000 Americans are preparing to cross the Rhine, while the real crossing happens elsewhere. Each deception had been executed with the precision of choreography. Sound timed to echo across valleys, radios scripted like dialogue, tanks arranged according to aerial perspective so reconnaissance planes would believe. It was not just strategy, it was storytelling. And every story told well enough becomes truth in the moment it's believed. The 116th Panzer Division, the Ghost's old adversary, never learned what had truly happened. Surviving officers interviewed after the war recalled the terror of invisible American armor appearing where none should be. One major confessed, "We thought they could move entire divisions overnight. We stopped trusting our eyes." That loss of faith, insight, and certainty was the Ghost Army's greatest victory. They hadn't just fooled their enemies. They had unmade their confidence. For decades after, the men carried fragments of those illusions inside them. In quiet studios and cluttered workshops, they built, painted, designed, always chasing the perfection of something that never quite existed. Bill Blass's fashion lines curved like the silhouettes of tanks beneath nets. Ellsworth Kelly's canvases hummed with the geometry of deception, planes of light and void, as if each color still hid a secret. Tony Schwartz experimented with layered sound, searching for the resonance of a world that wasn't real but felt true. They could never fully escape the war because they had fought it with the same tools they used to create beauty. To deceive so convincingly, one must first believe in the illusion, and some part of them always would. In the archives of Fort Belvoir, there is a faded letter written in 1945 by an unnamed private from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. It reads, "We made ghosts to fight monsters, but every ghost we made left one behind inside us." That line was found decades later in his sketchbook, next to a pencil drawing of a rubber tank deflating under rain, its shape folding inward like lungs releasing their final breath. The curators who discovered it placed the page behind glass. Visitors stand before it now in silence, reading those words through the reflection of their own faces. And in that reflection, the illusion continues. The modern age remembers war through pixels, drone footage, satellites, digital camouflage. Yet the essence of deception remains the same. Every soldier who lays false tracks, every cyber expert crafting phantom data, they all inherit the legacy of those 100 artists who once painted entire divisions from air. The Ghost Army proved that imagination could rewrite reality, that creativity could be as potent as firepower, that sometimes to protect truth you must first master the art of the lie. It is a paradox that endures. Beauty as defense, deception as mercy. On a misty morning near Metz long after the war, a local farmer found something buried beneath the soil, a collapsed form of rubber and canvas, its surface cracked and pale. He brushed off the dirt and realized what it was, the ghost of a tank. He dragged it to the edge of his field and propped it upright. For years it stood there, weathered by rain and sun, a silent monument to illusion. Children played around it, unaware that once it had terrified entire divisions. When asked why he kept it, the farmer smiled. "Because it reminds us," he said, "that sometimes what isn't real can still save lives." The artifact was eventually moved to a museum, its seams carefully restored. Visitors touch the fabric, feel the texture of history, soft, thin, and impossibly human. The surviving members of the Ghost Army are gone now, their voices scattered like echoes in static. But their story remains alive. In classrooms, museums, documentaries, and in the quiet awe of anyone who learns it for the first time. Young artists study their sketches. Military cadets analyze their tactics. Filmmakers recreate their illusions. And somewhere in all of it, those forgotten soldiers live again, still inflating their phantom tanks, still tuning their sound trucks, still painting the shadows of hope onto the landscape of despair. In 2022, a new exhibit opened at the Smithsonian. Visitors stepped into a dimly lit room where recordings from 1944 played softly through hidden speakers. The layered hum of engines, the murmur of voices in foreign tongues, the rustle of canvas. On the walls hung photographs, soldiers painting, smiling, crouching behind rubber giants. A quote was projected in white letters across the final wall. "Art is the last weapon of conscience." Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "The Ghost Army, 1944-1945. They fought with imagination." People left the room in silence, some wiping tears, others smiling faintly as if they had glimpsed something both impossible and true. At dusk, outside that same museum, the wind lifted across the Potomac. A group of students stood watching the river darken, talking softly about what they'd seen. One of them, an art student, said, "They made the enemy believe in ghosts." Her friend nodded. "Maybe that's what artists always do." The water shimmered with reflections of light, black, white, gold. The sound of traffic blended with the hum of evening air, and for a moment it almost felt like the faint pulse of generators, the breath of a phantom army setting up one last illusion beyond the horizon. When night falls on Europe, the ghosts return. Not as shadows, but as whispers, the sound of courage disguised as imagination. They walk unseen through the valleys where they once stood, touching the air as if testing it for sound. The wind ripples through tall grass like canvas filling with breath. Somewhere, a laugh echoes faintly, a young man's voice, carefree, defiant, then silence again. But in that silence lies everything they fought for, the belief that truth can be defended not only with strength, but with creativity, that illusion in the right hands can be an act of mercy, and that even ghosts, if born of compassion, can save the living.